Christ for us, what we get out of Paul's hymn and so on. Anybody got comments or questions after an hour of reflection or talking or whatever?
One image that I like is of Christ as the message and the messenger at the same time.
The message and the messenger. Mm-hmm. Is there a specific reference that you're getting at?
No, it's just I don't remember. I don't know if it's something you said before or but that stuck with me.
Yes, a lot of times that bringing him together that way. I mean, it resonates with me of something like we would say, well, Jesus spoke in parables, but he is the parable of the Father. He has a message, but he is the messenger. He told parables, he's the parable. He gave us, bits of wisdom, but he is the wisdom of the Father. He taught us about humanity, but he is the fullness of what human existence is all about. So I like that. I mean, as a way of pulling that together. Yeah.
In one of those passages that we could look up, at one point it said that in Christ all things hold together, or he holds all things together.
That's Colossians, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, okay. And I like that. And either just before that or just after that, and or in another one, there was something about reconciliation. All things are reconciled in Christ. While that would not have been my first or even my last title that I would have put as being one of my favorites for Christ, it in fact is a significant one for me in terms of some work that I hate to say it, work I've done with, reconciling my understanding of my mother, which happened in the fall of the year. And that has been a significant event. And, geez, there it is in Colossians, that it's about reconciliation.
Yeah.
Of course I knew this. It's an interesting connection.
Yes, Yes, reconciliation becomes one of the ways that Paul talks about what Christ did. He's got a whole bunch of ways of doing that, but reconciling is one. So that language puts us in mind that we were estranged from God, and that what Christ did was reconcile us to the Father.
And then things come together.
Yeah.
So there's no the fragmentation is less. It's more cohesive, more this way than that way.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, you could do that same thing a lot of different ways. The Gospels we've had lately that talk about Christ's response to betrayal is peace. Peace be with you. So instead of sharpening the divisions or responding harshly to it, he breaks through to a new way of dealing with the estrangement and the betrayals and the anger, which is reconciliation, which is peace. It's hard to... There's a theologian who we actually have coming here, James Allison, wrote the book, The Joy of Being Wrong. It's some of the freshest, newest theology stuff that I've read in many years. It's just fascinating. He's a follower. The Joy of Being Wrong is one of his books. Another one is called Raising of Abel. Rick Gallardi, again, who's such a great job of getting these speakers, has found a way to... He's in England, and he's going to fly from London to come. This guy is really something. And I don't know why I got started. There's a whole theory that he works out of that we call it mimetic rivalry, that we've set up a situation where we are desirous of what other people have. And because we're desirous of what other people have, therefore we set up rivalry situations. And we set up scapegoating mechanisms. That is, when it doesn't work right, we create a scapegoat. That's a image from the Hebrew Scriptures, where they put the sins of the people on the goat and send the goat out into the desert. So we create scapegoats in this theory. And that what Jesus was all about, as Allison sees it, is breaking through that general perception and way of living, and suggests there's just a whole other way of imaging human affairs, other way of living human relationships, not on the basis of recrimination or rivalry or an obsessive competitiveness, but on the basis of reconciliation and of peace and of joined together, but where there's then no need for any scapegoat or victimizing. I use some of that in my latest reflections again, where talking about how Christ sets up this new way. I like to speak of it in the sense of that when Jesus breathed on the disciples, he unleashed a new energy in the world. An energy that's absolutely opposed to the normal rivalristic energy, the competitive energy. It's a collaborative energy that's now available. I mean, it's here. I mean, it's not just a theory. You can actually live like that. Instead of being angry at one's father for the rest of one's life, one could actually take that energy and move it in another direction, and use it to grow and develop and so on. Yeah, the reconciliation theme is very important. Those hymns in the Colossians and Ephesians are wonderful. I mean, you know, it's disputed whether Paul wrote them or not, and clearly they were hymns that were available in the Christian community. I mean, I don't think he composed them. They were available, but, I mean, they're beautiful, powerful. First Colossians and First Ephesians. That organic unity. That's what influenced Teilhard de Chardin. Remember the story of Teilhard de Chardin, French paleontologist and geologist, and wrote The Divine Milieu and so on. Well, he was thinking at one time in his life he couldn't remain a Christian because he didn't fit in with his evolutionary view of the world and so on. And then he read those three passages, First Colossians, First Ephesians, and Romans 8, and said, my heavens, there's a whole view here that I can buy into. I don't have to leave the Catholic Church. I can stay in the church because here's a Christ I can buy into. It was the cosmic Christ, the Lord, the universal Christ, the one, as you said, that struck you there, that holds everything together. Everything's united in Christ. And in Christ there's this mutuality and equality. Those are beautiful hymns to read, to get a feel whether Paul wrote them or not. Those hymns all predate Paul anyway. So it's interesting, isn't it, how the early community found the hymn as a way of, propagating its sense of what Christ was about. Universal Christ. Yes, Patricia?
Paul's writing and the writing of the Gospels. And I wonder if he ever even heard many of the stories that are recorded in the Gospels.
Yeah.
Whereas their narrations, at least the first three, this is so different. He likes to give catalogs of virtues. And I guess I remember having a discussion with someone once who said that it was really Paul that got Christianity off the ground and gave it its shape because he was the great missionary to the Gentiles. And Jesus, in a sense, died from that. We forget about his resurrection, of course. But I'm wondering, how would you assess the relative impact of the Gospels versus the letters St. Paul in composing early Christian teaching that continues to influence our sense of what it means to be Christian today.
Yeah, it's really important observation. I'm just presuming people are... The question is how different the Gospels are than Paul. Although Paul uses the same word, this is my gospel, he said. This is my good news. And how different it is from the other four, from the four Gospels, where he shows almost no interest in the historical Jesus. There's almost nothing about that we'd pick up on any of his parables or miracles or cures or anything. There's so little in there. One view of that is that he did know that. In the 15 days he spent with Cephas and with James, the brother of the Lord, that he couldn't have been with them for 2 weeks without hearing the stories of Jesus. I mean, it's just not thinkable that you would be for 2 weeks with people who would follow Jesus around, and they wouldn't be saying, well, man, he cured this person or did that. It's not thinkable. So one has to assume that he knew the stories. It's also possible that he used the gospel material in his preaching, and therefore didn't have any need to repeat it in the letters. You got to remember the letters are occasional letters. He says, well, you could imagine that to the Philippians he told all the stories of the cures and everything, and then simply assumed that from then on in his letters, and just was writing to correct abuses, which is fundamentally what they're about. So that's at least possible that he did do that. In terms of the further question, about the influence, I think if you would ask people today when they walk out of church or hear the scripture readings, that it's the gospel stories that they remember. I think it's just normal human nature in a way that the stories are what you remember. So if we try to, do a test and say, well, tell me 3 stories that Jesus told, and then tell me 3 principles that Paul enunciated, it's probably the stories that we're going to remember. So in a sense, I think that has carried our notions, and presumably throughout Christian history. That's what gives the feel to it, I think. When people decide to say, how should I treat my neighbor, they think of the Good Samaritan parable. Or we're fighting for forgiveness or get over guilt feelings or whatever. Yeah, the prodigal son story. Or the, man, life feels like it's over. I'm overburdened by it, all my family troubles and health problems and so on. I feel like those guys in the boat when the storm came up and Jesus calmed the waves. I think you can almost presume that that's the material that has really moved the Christians as a whole. But when you look at the great movements theologically, I suppose especially my friend Jerry Carter pointed, he doesn't like Paul. He's here anyway. And his statement to me was he didn't like Paul coming in and he likes him less now. No. I forgot what I was going to say. It's funny that. What was I on?
Great theological.
Yeah. The big thank you. It's good to know somebody pays attention here when I've lost my train of thought. The theological big shifts seem like they've been Pauline. Augustine. What's Augustine reading when he does his conversion? Reading Paul. Not in drunkenness, not in licentiousness, but put on the Lord Jesus. He's reading Paul. Where's Luther get his stuff? Justification by faith alone. That's right from, he loved Galatians. I'm not saying that was, but that was the driving force. What was the driving force of Karl Barth? God is the transcendent one, the holy other. It's very Pauline. And as the commentary on the Epistle to the Romans had changed him. So I guess I'm not sure I want to be quoted in the Blade yet on this. Not that anyone would ever see it, but if I was, put it on the religion page and no one will ever see it. Put it on the sports page. That's but I'm seeing it at a popular level. It's the gospel stories that grab us and move us. But somehow the great theological movements seem to have a heavy Pauline emphasis to them. I don't know what that ends up, maybe it's part, I never thought of this before, but maybe it's part of the dichotomy that arose between popular Christianity and sort of the theological world. It's interesting, that's part of, I'm thinking of liberation theology. A lot of what it did was get back to the stories of Jesus and the stories of reaching out to the poor and the outcasts and so on. The historical Jesus became very important. Yeah, Sally?
Do you think that maybe more clergy have preached on the Gospels, and that's maybe why we know more?
Well, my guess is, and the way the liturgical thing is set up, the Gospel and the first reading are meant to go together. And sometimes in the liturgical year, the second reading's meant to go together, but always the first and third. So if you're sitting there as a preacher, there's a sort of gravity towards the first and third readings and away from the second reading. Which unfortunately, for today, we were planning on doing the ordinary Mass, the readings for the Mass, and it's John, 1 John. It's not Paul. I had to figure out what to do about that by 4:45. Yeah, Ann?
I find Paul harder to read because I feel like it's loaded with all of these pats on the back. Oh, you're doing a great job.
Yeah.
Not sure how much of it is, when you're looking for information.
Yeah.
In our current times, things that are bulleted, it's much easier to pull out. And so I feel like this is kind of flowery and much more difficult to kind of get
the point.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Whereas when you're reading the Gospels, those parables, they really jump right out
Yeah.
at you.
That's a good point. Comment about the very style. Now, you get back to the fundamental point. They are occasional letters. It'd be the same way, if I looked at your correspondence with somebody and I'd say, is she talking about, I don't care about that she went on a picnic yesterday. I want to know what's the point. And then I'd have to read through half the letter before I get to what's the point of the letter. So, it's just built into the literary form that we've got with Paul. That's why it is so hard to get at, what Paul's theology is. You got big tomes written. This is probably one of the better ones by James Dunn, The Theology of Paul the Apostle. Where you call through the letters and try to figure out what's the core theology behind this. And it's really hard to do in many ways. And some people, sort of give it up after a while and wonder if you can really do that. That became the method that I decided on for today was not to do that, not to try to do a theology of Paul, but to take the letters as a whole and let them do what they were intended to do. That is, there's probably little snippets in each one that could illumine something, could guide us. Whereas when I did this years ago, I tried to do a theology of Paul. And I think it becomes sort of artificial that way. Jerry?
Not to be defensive.
Yeah, you're the guy who hates Paul. Let's admit it, Jerry.
Well, it seems I've read that there has been a fairly significant body of thought that the early church was far too influenced by Paul.
That was part of...
all proportions of...
Yeah.
what his place should have been in the church.
Well, I mean, Pat alluded to it. The idea often is said that that Paul, the founder of Christianity, isn't Jesus, but Paul, as we know it. That he got away from it, the essential points of Jesus, and went off in his own direction, and is the true founder of Christianity, and not Jesus. I mean, I don't buy that, but one sees your point. I mean, you can see how that could happen.
I can see, one of the things I'm getting out of today is I can see that perhaps he was just the right person at the right time. It was perhaps very likely maybe the church would have just been smothered in its cradle if there had been a Paul.
Oh yeah, a great image that Jerry just said. The church would have been smothered in its cradle if there wasn't Paul. I mean, I think that's right. It had to branch out. It had to move forward. It had to include the Gentiles. I mean, it wasn't going anyplace otherwise. That's great. Smothered in its cradle. I like that. We used to play ball against and with each other. Yeah, right. With and against. Yes, Mariel.
Is part of the difficulty with Paul in the translation itself, or does that go back to the original Greek?
No, it's not a matter of translation. Okay. It's the original Greek.
Okay,
yeah. No, that's not the problem. What you're getting, I mean, what you got in the English translation, I mean, there's a lot of times there's Greek words that could be interpreted different ways, but fundamentally we know what he was about. And he's going to sound arrogant whether he was in Greek or Latin or English. It doesn't really matter.
It isn't so much how he sounds as when I read it, I keep looking for a period or a semicolon. And oftentimes there isn't any, and so
it just goes on. She wants a semicolon in there. David? Yeah.
And of course, the church has to do this by understanding the gospel, and the gospel is read by.
Yeah, I think the essence is that Paul's more abstract language doesn't have the same impact as the colorful, vivid language of the Gospels. I mean, I imagine that's true. You could just test it. I mean, say there was no homily at Mass to slant, wherein I suppose a lot of times there really isn't one, so, and people aren't paying attention anyway. And just, what would you pick up from the other three readings? And my guess is that it wouldn't have the same impact. Abstract language generally doesn't, but theologians like it. We revel in it and so on. But I don't think that it generally speaks. Dave.
You said how Paul influenced Chardin and so many others. How did he influence Ronner?
That's a good question. How did he influence Ronner? One of the things, one part of it is that Ronner had a more sophisticated understanding of the major, what's often thought of as the major theme of Paul, that is justification by faith. So Ronner was not just ready to swallow that. He thought that the justification by faith, which, again, I'm not sure it is the core theme, but many, many authors say it is, Ronner's position was that it was not faithful to Galatians. So in Galatians, the problem isn't faith and works. The problem is got to do with faith in Jesus and keeping the Jewish law. So that what Luther did was to take the dialectic in Galatians and put it into a new context, where it's not faith versus the Jewish law, it's now faith and works. So that became, the basis of the Reformation. And the word alone, see, Paul never said alone, faith alone, justification by faith alone. That's Luther. That's the Reformation, justification by faith alone. No works, no indulgences, not all this other bad stuff that was going on. So Ronner always saw Paul as saying that justification through faith always included works. And his famous idea was that shouldn't divide Christians anymore. That he saw that all Protestants could move within the Catholic circle on this. That it was no longer a divisive issue. It was not a dividing point. What say you about faith and works? And of course, Ronner's been proved right on that by the Lutheran Catholic joint declaration, approved at the highest levels on justification by faith, which essentially says that same thing. That it's not faith alone in the sense that works have no play in what Christians do, but God's initiative is here. And Ronner was big on that out of Paul. The initiative is always God. God first loved us. That's why we can love others. God sends the Spirit upon us. That's why we can do good works. But it isn't dichotomous, and it isn't faith alone. So I think that the influence of Paul on Ronner becomes it's much more sophisticated on the part of Ronner than the simplistic ways it's been interpreted. And he always saw through that. He saw from the beginning that didn't make sense, that division. So that's why I said that we could unite tomorrow. It's a little exaggeration. Unite soon with mainline Protestants. We could unite soon. There's just absolutely no reason we can't do it. So that's one way to look at where Ronner was at on it. What about the last one? Should we do number 4? It seems simpler to me to pick what theme there is or notion that we want to deal with, and that is divisions in the church. Because the first 4 chapters of 1 Corinthians is dealing with divisions in the church. And in the later part of the letter, it's trying to figure out how we're going to overcome those. So question that I could raise in reading 1 Corinthians is, how do we deal with polarization in the church today? And, we still got that. I might elaborate. I was just at a meeting in Chicago a couple months ago of the Common Ground Project. As some people know, I was involved in that at the beginning with 4 years working with Cardinal Bernardine on the Common Ground Project, which dealt with polarization in the church. So after 10 years, that was 10 years ago, when that document came out, Called to be Catholic. You believe that? Well, anyway, on the 10th anniversary, they had a meeting in Chicago like, well, where do we go from here kind of thing. And I have not been involved since the beginning. Well, I was at a few conferences, and so they brought some of us back in a sense, well, how do you see all this thing? And part of my input on that occasion was to say that at one level, the main problem isn't polarization. I mean, we do not have a polarized group in here. Well, we got Jerry, but he's an anomaly. I mean, it's and largely, I mean, many parishes where I don't know, Joy's parish, is it polarized? I don't think so. No, there's a couple parishes that are probably polarized because people don't like the way where they put the tabernacle or something. But so I've always questioned and wonder still yet whether that is the real dynamic that we have to deal with. To me, and we do at some levels. I mean, we're polarized at the macro level. There's no doubt about that. you can read about it. Theological groups are at loggerheads, and people aren't getting along. So there's, at certain levels, macro levels, high levels, and so on, there is polarization. There's no doubt about it, and it's some at the lower level. But the other kind of dynamic that is around is the interplay between the rich pluralistic tradition we've got and the real needs of people today. The real interest in the spiritual journey, or how do you make the marriage work, or how do you find some meaning in your job, or how do you find what your path in life is, and the rich pluralistic tradition. I think that still plays, I mean, it's a commentary on how you would read 1 Corinthians, I suppose. But we got the question of polarization, and then we've got the question of pluralism, which, I mean, I would see positively that we've got various approaches, and the question is, how do you make these into a synergistic mix? That is, how do you bring together the various pluralistic positions, diverse positions, and hold it together around some unity? And I think Paul, really has essential answers to us there. And how do we deal with other kind of divisions that occur among us? How do you deal with the fact that we've got Ronarians and Baltazarians and liberationists? How do you bring all of that together? So that's one way to begin to think of looking at Corinthians, which I don't know if I made that clear. We could read it just in terms of Cardinal Bernardine's terrible nightmare that the polarization was going to reduce our effectiveness and we would diminish ourselves as a church and so on. You could do that. But I do think you can read it as well in terms of the question of pluralism and how we would make that a positive rather than what some people think of as a negative. So Paul spent a lot of time at Corinth. And the backdrop to that, remember he was working his way down. He jumped over there from Asia Minor. You see, he was over there in Asia Minor, and he jumped over there and got into northern Greece, and then begins to work his way down, and he gets to Athens. And do you remember the famous thing that happens in Athens? He goes into the Areopagus, and they've got there an altar to the unknown God. And he says to them, yes, what a flash of brilliant insight. I'll tell you who that unknown God is. You got an unknown God here. This is who it is. And then he begins to tell them about it. And the Athenians, the philosophers, that's the center of knowledge, of philosophy, Athens, And after he begins to tell them about Jesus and his death and resurrection, they say famously, "We will hear you again on this sometime." The classic put down. So Paul left Athens defeated and goes to Corinth and famously says, "I will now preach Jesus Christ and him crucified." No more of this clever philosophy and so on. I will preach now Jesus Christ and him crucified. And that's what he does when he goes to Corinth. And he stays there, I think, a year and a half. He had like a 10-year association with these people. He knew them better probably than any of the other communities. He was like at Philippi for a month or something. So he was there a year and a half in Corinth and trying to work his way through doing his tent making or leather making thing so it wouldn't be a burden on the people, so he could pay his way and they wouldn't have to support him. And then he's extremely concerned after he leaves Corinth about what's going on there. Word gets back to him about these divisions. And as he said, some say they're followers of Apollos, and some Cephas, and some Paul, and some Christ. These divisions. And then, interestingly enough, he doesn't say, "But let's jump on the Paul thing." He says, none of that's right. All these divisions are right because we're all one in Christ. Because we're all finally united in Christ. So, he hears about these divisions and he's upset about them, and you get the impression that this community in Corinth is just all over the place, and what he doesn't like especially is that it extends to the Eucharist, that the divisions that are there now are happen at Eucharist, and it happens something like this, the one theory anyway of what he meant, that they'd met in house churches. They didn't have a church building, obviously, so they met in houses, and it would usually be the well-to-do at big houses where they could come. And that what seemed to be happening is that the well-to-do invited other well-to-do people there first for a little gathering, for food and drink and so on, before the other lower class poor people could come. You can just imagine that happening, can't you, naturally? Have a few friends over, special friends are over before we have the Eucharist. We have a meal together and so on, and then the others will get there and we'll be fine. So Paul is very upset about this practice because he thinks it's part of this division-creating bit that's going on, and it's hurting the body of Christ. Which brings up another idea that you find in here, something he borrowed from the Stoics. The Stoics were philosophers, I guess, epitomized in Epictetus, and the Stoics somehow had this kind of idea that you had to sort of get into a passionless state, so you weren't too desirous of anything, and therefore weren't too disappointed about what was going on around you. That's where we get the Stoic attitude. You know, he says, I have a stoic wife. She's, reduced passion here. We've got, so you can manage life better. So, anyway, out of the Stoics were influential, too, on this body idea. So Paul takes this body image and says, this is how the community of followers is, that we all are part of the body. And we all have to cooperate to make the body work. And it's all the wonderful thing. Just because you're not an eye doesn't mean that you're not important. And all the parts are important. They can't function without them. So don't look down on some parts. All are called to build up the body of Christ. And then he talks about the whole idea of charisms. That's a Greek word. That's where our word charismatic comes from. Charisms meant a free gift. So for Paul, they were free gifts of the Spirit. Charisms. Everybody who was baptized had charisms. Free gifts of the Spirit. And Paul's big point is you can't use them just for your own self-interest or advancement, but you have to use them to build up the body of Christ. And then that created the problem of some people thought their gifts were better than other people's gifts. And one of the gifts they really prized was glossolalia, which is a Greek word which means many tongues. They spoke in tongues. We still have that phenomenon today. I've seen that break up families. Collegian comes, gets involved in a group, a non-Catholic Bible study thing. They speak in tongues. And now she thinks her parents, who don't speak in tongues, will not be saved and are not real Christians. It's a common occurrence today. Now I speak in tongues and you don't, therefore she's got to figure out how to get her mother to speak in tongues so her mother will get to heaven. So that's the kind of problems created. So that was the problem that they thought that was a special gift and it was about everything else. And Paul's answer to it is then the great hymn of love in chapter 13. That's what it's about. You can do everything. You speak in tongues and so on. And if you don't have charity, you don't have love, then you're nothing. You're a sounding gong or something. It doesn't amount to anything. So that's Paul's way of trying to tell them that the spiritual gifts, they're nice and so on, but don't give them too much prominence here, or prophecies and so on. But it all is something we can all do, and that is live out this law of love. It's a love that's patient and kind. It is not rude or thin-skinned. It's ready to excuse and to forgive. And when everything else passes away, love is what will remain, which becomes, sort of a dominant theme in that whole letter than 1 Corinthians.
Oh, let's see if we got questions about that or about what we're going to read here. Or other things we should bring about. There is a Christology that stands behind all of that, and Mary Jo brought it up before in the reconciling part, but that the unity finally is based on our baptism, that we're baptized into Christ, and as members of Christ and as joined to Christ, there is this fundamental equality. And so then you have to ask yourself, well, what is it that Christ does for all the members of the body and all the baptized people? And that's where you get your various ways of talking about what Jesus does. One is to reconcile. Another is that he redeems us. The redemption metaphor suggests that, well, there was a debt to be paid, a debt that's caused by sin. We have to repay that debt, and Christ helps us to do that. There would be a notion of sacrificing, that Christ sacrifices, self-sacrificing love in order to bring us back into union with the Father. So there's a lot of different ways that Paul talks about Christ and what he does to create this fundamental unity. But it's always in terms of the Father. The initiative is always with the Father. So the typical phrase for Paul and the Gospels is not that Jesus rose from the dead, but that the Father raised Jesus to life. And so all this stuff he's doing, he's on a mission given to him by the Father. Paul is faithful to the Gospel and all of that. That it's the Father's work. That's what causes this. This is what enables this to all happen here. We need a question or something to pull that together,
With all the stories of Christ that would have been available to Paul, how did he come to see through it? Everybody says, oh, Christ did this, Christ did that. How did he get that wisdom to see that God was the one that Christ was?
No. Well, Paul says that it didn't come from human beings. It didn't come from any initiative on his part. It came totally from the Father. Remember back in the Galatians passage, where he tells about his own conversion, it's God let him see the Son. God let him see the risen Lord. It isn't even Christ's initiative. It's God is the active agent in that conversion experience, and working always through Christ. So Paul's own answer is that that's a revelation from the Father. His own language is that we always talk about the conversion of Paul, but it seems as though he interpreted it more as a commissioning. That he saw this, whatever that was about, was commissioning him to spread this good news that he was able to see. If you asked Paul, well, tell me about your conversion, he probably said, what? It was a missioning, a commissioning that I think is the way he tended to see or talk about what he was all about. But again, God's initiative and revelation from the deity that would let him see that. Yeah.
I like the Jewish idea of Day of Atonement.
Yeah.
And if we had one, I would think it would be Easter, but I don't see that we ever tie those ideas together.
Yeah, Jerry raised the question of atonement. That is, again, another metaphor used by Paul to say what Jesus was doing. He was atoning for our sins. The word is interesting. In English, it becomes at-one-ment, at-one-ment, atonement, so that we become unified with Christ in this reconciliation with the Father. I want to springboard that and get back to the original comment I made when he left Athens, and he decided to preach Jesus Christ and Him crucified. And I would say that is the core of what Paul is seeing about Christology. It's the crucifixion that is big for him. We're saved by the crucified Christ. He's also the risen Christ and becomes life-giving spirit for Paul. But I preach Jesus Christ and Him crucified. That is what Paul wants to emphasize. I mean, if you're going to say what's at the center of his theology, you're going to try to do that. It's somewhere around that. It's the death of Christ. And that death is an obedient death. It's a self-sacrificing death. you get that same notion in John's Gospel, where the moment of glorification, Jesus kept saying, the time of glorification is coming. The time when I'll be glorified by my Father is coming. And when will that be? When I'm lifted up on the cross. So I see a similarity there between John and Paul. That's the moment when I'm lifted up on the cross. That is the moment of God's greatest glory. That's when the self-sacrificing love reaches its definitive and irrevocable peak. Those are two words borrowed from Ronner, that what he thinks the death of Jesus means. So the point would be that up until death, we can always revise our fundamental option. We can always change our direction. We can always go back on it. It's only in death that our commitment to God would be final, definite, definitive, and irrevocable. So when we talk about the cross of Christ, right, we're saved by the crucifixion of Christ. You would say, well, we could have pricked his finger and he would have suffered that and saved us. No. It's got to be the death. Because here's again the way Ronner would see this. Jesus is the representative of the whole human family. And this is Pauline. He's the representative of the whole human family. And he hands himself over completely to the Father. And he can do that finally and irrevocably without ever changing his mind or going back on it, only by death. That's true for all of us. Ronner says our death is our freest moment. Freest moment we'll ever have is our moment of death, when it's all the chips are on the table and you're going to either try to maintain one's own
if there's any questions anybody's got before I do that. Questions about Paul in general or his letters? Yes.
When you were talking about seeing this in context of death and dying and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and all
yeah.
that. And so my question is that in one of the passages that I read just now, we were talking about don't grieve like the people do that have no hope.
Right.
So I'm wondering what the Hebrews' idea of afterlife was and well, we know the Egyptians thought, all the pyramids and stuff, they were
yes.
have an afterlife. But did the Hebrews and did the Hellenistic people have a view of afterlife?
Yes. The question is asked about cultural context for looking at the question of the afterlife. And you're very correct about the fact that the Egyptians, which had a very developed sense of the afterlife. That's why we got those pyramids and everything. It was a very elaborate sense of a continuing life. But the Israelites were slow to take that up. Actually, in the course of the history of the biblical period, there's a long period of time where there is no sense of the afterlife like that. In fact, I think we usually think of it all the way into about the year 150 BC, when the book of Wisdom was written, which has that wonderful phrase, the souls of the just are in the hands of God, when the Israelites would have come to some sense of the afterlife. That's what creates the problem of the book of Job, which was written maybe about 450 BC, is that, somebody reading that could say, well, Job had terrible luck going on here on this earth, but he'll get to heaven. But that if it wasn't available to them. I mean, his three friends come in and they're not saying, well, you're going to get to heaven, stick with it. They're saying, you must be doing something wrong. You're having all this trouble. So the idea generally through much of the Israelite history was that there was no resurrection. They didn't have that idea. And even if there was an afterlife, they called it, you went to Sheol. It was a very shadowy kind of existence, not the kind of things that the Muslims would see, paradise and all the pleasures of paradise. It was a very low-grade type of existence. So it's only later Judaism that came to that idea, and that was, in the Gospels, you will see this reflected. The Sadducees, who were centered on the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, don't believe in the resurrection. And that's played to. But the Pharisees, who were more into the later developments, did believe in the resurrection. So Paul, being a Pharisee at the time of Jesus, would have already had an idea of an afterlife and a resurrection. He would have had that. Not all Jews would have shared that. The Sadducees would be, and their followers would be a good example of that. So it's a very mixed thing. But there is this, therefore, Paul does have a framework for beginning to think about this whole question out of the general resurrection of the dead. But that general idea is very different from his revelation on the road to Damascus, that this Jesus is alive, is back, is operative in the world. That's the decisive thing. It isn't like Paul was, as a Pharisee, had a good idea of resurrection and therefore could weave it into his writing. It's not that. This is a decisive change for him, that Jesus has been raised to life. And that's what he wants to preach.
So it's not just that Paul is converted, but that he realizes Jesus is working in the world?
Right, yeah. So, we'll see that in the third section I want to do on Philippians, which I devote to the Christology, to understanding who Jesus is. That maybe we'll get into that more then. Okay?
He was preaching to the Greeks, is that right?
Paul, I mean, he wasn't restricted entirely, because one of his strategies seemed to be to go to the synagogues. That's not entirely clear, but I mean, surely there were Jewish converts among his converts. But he is the apostle to the Gentiles. He says he divided up this way. Cephas, or Peter, had the mission of preaching to the Jews, and he had the mission of preaching to the Gentiles. That's the broad category. But did Paul preach to some Jews? Of course. Were there some Jewish converts to Christianity? Yes. But his focus and his genius is around the Gentiles. Yeah.
Do you think that with our general tendency to medicate people at the end of their lives, so that they very, very often are asleep and gradually sort of sleep away, as we put it, that maybe we're cheating people out of the opportunity to experience their own death?
Yeah. Questions asked about create a lot of effort to medicate people at the end and so on. I have personal experience of that. When my mother was dying, I personally gave her morphine at night before she went to sleep, but she was lucid throughout. I mean, so the morphine that I gave her at night was, didn't medicate her to the point she talked about her death openly till all the way through that time. So at least it seems like there's the possibility of that. I was very, aware of what was going on. That's why I could have that conversation with my mother that I often talk about, where I said to her while she was, probably at night when I was giving her the morphine, I said that, Mom, you don't have much control over anything anymore, do you? And she said, no, I don't have control over anything. And James, neither do you. So wisdom flowed from her mouth till the end. But I mean, I just anointed a lady the other night, and I mean, she's sort of in and out. I know they're started giving her morphine now. The problem of pain, I remember Earl Harris. I don't know if anybody in here remembers Earl Harris. He taught at Scott High School and became an assistant principal. He used to come to events all the time. He'd come with a blanket, and remember that? And Earl was very interested in staying with it. That's why he used to come to everything we did. I remember he'd go to noon Mass over in the Falvey Chapel, and he'd often lie down during Mass, but he had everything wrong with him in the world. And I remember he telling me, he says, if I go out during Mass, don't run to the phone. Don't rush. And Earl, he stayed with it all the time. And then I remember at the end, he ended up in a nursing home and visiting him, and he always wanted to talk about ideas and intellectual stuff, and at the end he couldn't do that anymore. The pain took him over. And he wanted to experience all of that, but then everything was wrong with him. And I remember the last time I saw him, he couldn't no longer, his mind still could engage with ideas, but his body now was just too racked with pain. I remember thinking it's consuming him to keep from doing what he wanted to do. So, there's no doubt we're in a death-denying culture, but maybe, and that's why I always like to anoint people before that while they're still conscious. Get the whole family together, get the friends together, do the anointing while the person's still conscious. Maybe that's their time to reflect on it. And then just one other thought occurs to me, that Ronner thought that peaceful stage that Elizabeth Ross talks about, that's when people really died. That they were then dead. Their heart was still beating, the brain singing, but in any theological sense, a sense of meeting the Lord, of whatever brings that peacefulness, they had done that. They were with the Lord now. So I find that fascinating. Who knows if that's right or not, but I find that fascinating, this whole thing. It plays into the thing of, it's a process, and maybe we're not cheating them to medicate them at the end if we've given them the chance earlier. I think that's where I'm at. Then we're not cheating people of that chance. Yes?
In chapter 4, it talks about those getting to know Jesus, will be with Jesus. My problem with a lot of Christians is that they have this thing, if you don't believe in Jesus, you're absolutely not going to heaven. As a nurse, I held many dying people's hands, and I refuse to believe that all the Jewish people are going to hell.
Yeah.
I refuse to believe that.
Yeah.
Now, am I wrong?
No, the question is made, the general comment is made that we can't be exclusive in our idea of salvation. We can't think that people who haven't accepted Jesus are going to hell. And fortunately, you had, in her intuitions are, you couldn't say that. She's not going to hold the hand of a Jewish people dying and think they're going to hell. And fortunately, in our Catholic tradition, we have a very good basis for holding that. That is the Second Vatican Council and all of the documents that Gaudium et Spes, number 21, is an example, and number 16, Lumen Gentium, which says God does not deny the grace of salvation, even to those who have not yet learned to call him by name, if they follow their conscience. So you're holding the hand of someone following their conscience. You can have perfect assurance that they're going to be with God. And you have good, solid Catholic basis in the Vatican II. There's a number of places. You could go look those up. Document on the Church, number 16, and the Pastoral Constitution, number 21, would just be two examples of many that are like that, where you see a clear statement of that. Yeah.
As I read the letter...
Did you read the whole thing, by the way?
Yes.
Do you know how long it took you, or? We had a half-hour break.
It took me 23 minutes.
Yeah.
I don't know. That was a guess.
But you read it easily in a half hour.
Yes.
Well, I was interested in that for the rest of the day.
I read it easily in a half an hour.
Yeah, okay. Go ahead.
But what stood out to me was like Paul first emphasizes treating your own body well, living right.
I hope, is everyone hearing this? Speak real loud. I don't want to have to repeat all this.
The first point that stood out to me was the business of treating your own self, your own body right, and living healthily, living well, living with respect. And then he emphasizes loving one another.
Yeah.
And then it struck me as it was quite a jump, kind of abrupt. All of a sudden, the next paragraph is about death and resurrection. And what I wondered was, is there such a thing as Christianity that doesn't believe there's a place called heaven where people will congregate after the end of this life?
Is there a form of Christianity that holds that? I don't think so. I mean, I think it's essential to the whole of the Christian message that we share in the resurrection of the Lord. That's part of it. We have mics here if we get in this situation. Thank you very much. In case we need that. A lot of times I can just repeat. No, I wouldn't know of anything like that. It seems essential. The whole of the New Testament is written in the light of the resurrection of Jesus. And the whole of that resurrection has got to do with Christ sharing that life-giving Spirit with us. So, I mean, you could do different imagery of what that's all about. You know, the imagery is communal. That is, the common imagery for that afterlife is the heavenly banquet, the marriage feast, walking around in Jerusalem, in the city. No, it's not sitting in a rocking chair by yourself. I mean, the biblical imagery that is used to describe that has a very communal sense to it, that we share that with others. Whole communion of saints is built on that. The creeds are built on it. The baptismal statements are built on that. Are there individual Christians who have questions about that? Yes. Are there a lot of people who have questions about what that's all about? For sure. I mean, I've always been comfortable, I don't know, totally comfortable, pretty comfortable with the language of the fulfillment of the longings of our hearts. Someone said that to me at the funeral, that I used it at the memorial mass yesterday, and he said, "You say that all the time." Yes, I do. That I'm at ease with. There is a fulfillment of the longings of the heart. The longings of the heart are for meaning and purpose, to think that everything we're about is worthwhile, that there is an ongoing life for us. I mean, in terms of what that means or what that's like, I would be far more hesitant. I'm just speaking personally now. But I mean, the clear tradition is resurrection shared by those connected in with Christ through the power. That's what he's all about. But what imagery to use is something else. We had two main ways of talking about it. It is the resurrection of the body, which is the more traditional way. It's in the creeds, it's in the baptismal promises, resurrection of the body. And secondly, immortality of the soul, which is more of a Greek idea and not a biblical idea. So we've always had two ways of talking about it. Resurrection of the body, more traditional, more biblical, and immortality of the soul, later, more Greek influence and so on. Rahner said that we have no way of combining those two. There's no way to put those two ideas together. But each one preserves something of what we think is our fate. So the resurrection of the body reminds us that this deficient, defective bodiliness that we carry with us is part of us. We are inspirited bodies. Our bodies are not, as I always say, not like the first stage of a rocket that we jettison as the soul flies up to heaven. The body reminds us that we're saved as whole people. And that has ramifications, of course. Flannery O'Connor said that she didn't understand Catholic thought on sexuality until she understood the resurrection of the body. because what it puts us on is a great understanding of the importance of the human body and our sexual drive and as sexual creatures, and that is part of us that we carry with us. My teacher, John Macquarie, tutor at Oxford, said that the best image we have, best human analog for what this would be, is when the primates became human in the evolutionary process. So that from one day to the next, as that transition was made, nothing was left behind. The primates that had become human still had the same brain and cortex and bodiliness, but now everything was different. Everything was different. Now they could reflect, they could develop the arts, they could communicate in deeper ways, and so on, where nothing is left behind. And Macquarie thinks that that's the way to think of what death is. It's to pass, like the first primates passed to the human race, it's to pass from what we are now to a new and richer life where the time-space dimensions don't hold, in which everything will be different, and yet we leave nothing behind of what we've been, of what we've done, of what we've accomplished, of what we were deficient in. We leave nothing behind into the new life. So there's a lot of ways of thinking about what that's all about. Yeah.
I read this thing twice through and it really puzzled me as I read it. The only conclusion I could come up with is that I have no chance, the new creation, apart from all the rest of you who bear the mark of the Spirit. I just don't have a ghost of a chance.
So you got that communal sense out of it.
Terrible.
Saved, and that's been part of it. We're saved as a member of a people. It's not me and God. It's not just a totally vertical relationship. It's just not me and God. And that's been our Catholic sense. We picked that up. That's why we gather for liturgy. That's why we form communities. That essential sense of communal nature of salvation. I think Paul would be happy with that reading. I think that's part of what he intended by all of this.
So I have a chance.
Yeah. And we all play a role in it. Yeah. Yes.
Why did Paul make such a point to say that if the second coming, the dead would go first, and then those who were left on?
Yeah.
Is there any?
Yes. I mean, the context of all of this is, in fact, it changes from one letter to the other. This is interesting. In this early writing, the larger context is Paul has what we call an imminent expectation of the second coming in 1 Thessalonians. You know, his clear mindset is this is going to happen pretty soon. In fact, he thinks it's going to happen in his lifetime. So he will be one of those that's still around and is raised up with the others. So the language is we. You know, when we will be raised up like that. So he sees himself as this happening soon and being part of it. So there's no problem here of, well, what are we going to do centuries from now? Because he thinks it's happening real soon. And that was that general expectation in those early decades, that the Lord would return soon. And there's gospel statements. This generation will not pass away till all these things have happened. That's put on the lips of Jesus in the Gospels. Now, according to the embarrassment criteria, one of the ways we try to figure out if something was really said by Jesus is it embarrassing or not? And if it's embarrassing, we can almost be sure he said it. I mean, if you're writing in the middle 80s, when this generation has already passed away, when they're all gone, for the most part, and you put in there, Jesus says, this generation will not pass away till all these things have happened. I mean, you're not going to make that up in the year 85. Well, because it makes Jesus look bad. So the theory is that he must have said things like that. And they remembered it, and they had to put, they made it part of it. So there was this imminent expectation that the end time was coming. And then it's only later, and you see this progression in Paul's letters, that where he later wrestles with this in Philippians of, geez, do I want to go now? Is it better to go now or to stay around and do this ministry that I'm doing? He's now faced with sort of a new question for himself. He puts that in there. Am I going to go now? Or did I prefer that I die now so I can be with Jesus and enjoy the resurrection? Or would I stay around and keep ministering? So it's an important part of the what we call the eschatology, his large viewpoint of what's happening in the history of Christianity and of the world. So it's a framework within which the whole gospel of Jesus and Paul's teaching is set. It's vitally important. What he was convinced of was the parousia. That is what they called very often the second coming of Christ. When he would complete the work, just like he said. He's going to establish the kingdom, the second coming, then it's established. But that was a live option. They used to pray facing the east. So they would see him when he came on the clouds of heaven. That's why they faced the east praying. Get ready for that. He'd come in the clouds of heaven and be ready for it. They were ready for it all the time. The question now becomes, for us, well, almost nobody has that expectation. We had it in the year 2000 as we approached it. There were a lot of Christians who were convinced it was going to happen, just like happened in the year 1000, I must say. And it's happened periodically throughout history, where people say, well, don't pay your mortgages, this is the end time, and we had Christian people saying that as we approached 2000, and you might remember that. It was quite a large movement and so on. But for most people, the parousia is not imminent. It's not just right around the corner. So what are we going to do about it? What does it mean? My teacher, again, Ronner, said that we shouldn't talk about the second coming. No, because it makes it sound like he came once and then left us forever and then will return again. No, he wants to talk about that as the completion of Christ's work, because he's always here. Christ is always here in our midst and strengthening us, guiding us, forgiving us, and so on. His Spirit's always with us. And so the second, what we call the parousia, would be more the completion of his work, not a second coming. And that's an attempt to reinterpret this in a large frame when we've been going 2,000 years now and it hasn't come, and nobody's, not many people at least are like expecting it tomorrow. In fact, for most Christians today, it's not a live part of our belief. And that's why Ronner wants to stress the idea that Christ is here now, in our midst, in our everyday activities. Anyway, it's a crucially important point you raise. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to go back to something you just mentioned where Paul is struggling with, would it be better for me to go now?
Yeah.
And that struck me as also a part of his conversations about death, because wouldn't someone, even some of the martyrs that we have today, they say, I'm going to commit this act, I'm going to end now rather than continue on in the world trying to promote the philosophy or religion. But the other thing is suicide.
Yeah.
And I wonder how many people who are depressed and going through dark times have these thoughts, because I've had friends express similar ideas. And he doesn't go on to elaborate on his thought process, with all of that, how he goes from questioning it to, where he eventually ends up.
Where he ends up, yeah.
Yeah, but I thought that was very relevant to those who have those kinds of dark thoughts.
Yeah, the whole question here is raised of suicide and how we think that through. I think the dominant category that comes into play, it comes from Paul as well, and that is that our total dependence upon God, and that everything that we are and are about, our very life, is gift from that God. And we don't have total disposal of it. People feel that in terms of vocation in life, or of a call to commitment. There's something larger calling me to act in a certain way. The call of conscience and so on. And it's based on the idea that we're not autonomous beings. We many of us sense we're dependent, and therefore we're accountable. And therefore in that frame, which I think changes it, you can't just say, well, yeah, I got this great idea, I'll get to the Lord soon, and commit suicide. I find interesting those after-death experiences where the people who commit suicide don't see the light in the same way. I don't know what to make of all those. They're in a very shadowy kind of thing. Almost sounds like the Jewish Sheol to me. But anyway, that's an aside. But I think once one sees total dependence upon God and life as a gift, then the answer was there for Paul. He might have recognized it, but he had to keep ministering. He had to keep putting one foot in front of the other.
But the beautiful thing about Paul is that he expresses that very human struggle that goes on. I mean, he's imprisoned, people treat him shabbily and all of that. He's saying, well, do I really have to go on? Should I go on?
And which people resonate. I mean, there's Monday mornings when one wonders if one wants to get out of bed or not,
Yeah.
And the people who suffer from depression is just horrible. I mean, it's a darkness, terrible thing that makes it look all impossible and so on. I have to make a decision about time.
I was struck by the fact in 2 Thessalonians chapter 16 where he talks about the encouragement of God and the grace of God and how pertinent that is as much today over the centuries as it was in 51.
Yeah.
And also mentions that, and if you believe in that and work toward that end, may the Lord direct your hearts to the love of God and the endurance of Christ.
What chapter and verse is that?
That's in chapter 3:5.
Yeah.
But it's just so important today and pertinent today as it was.
Right, yes it is, yeah.
Carried over the
It's a good example of a classic text. In other words, that speaks to our heart. That speaks to someone struggling today. Right?
Not only struggling, but getting an answer.
Yeah.
Getting the answers from God.
Yeah. Again, total dependence in everything we do. As I said, I got to make a decision what we're going to do. Last one, I think.
Well, I've struggled for years with this thought that when we pass over, when our physical body dies as we know it here, what happens? Is there a theology about this? In other words, I guess I've come to the conclusion that when we pass to the other side, and this is just my personal thoughts on this, there is another dimension that we go to while we wait for this completion of Christ. And I have no idea if that's really wrong or if there's a possibility. But when my husband was dying, one morning he woke up and said to me, "Are we here or are we there?"
Yeah.
And another
It's common.
time he said, "Do you know we're all connected? I see we are all connected."
Yeah.
And so it makes me feel even more so that we pass from
this state to another dimension where maybe there's no time, where we see all things, because he was predicting things that happened later that he saw when he was in that state. And so I just, is that against our faith to think of something like that?
Well, first of all, I think the comment is made about that when we pass over, which isn't a bad way of talking about what death is, to pass from one form of existence to another, that in that state there is a sort of organic unity and everyone is united, and that people get maybe premonitions of that ahead of time. And first of all, I think yes. My answer to that is yes. You'll talk to people who have a sense of that. And what you just described, what your husband went through, is a classic mystical experience. And there's probably in this room 30% of people, if we're on average, that know what you're talking about by their own experience. I'm not really going to take a poll right now, but there are many people who know what you just said, what your husband experienced. That is, they've had their moments when all of the divisions seemed rather illusory, when all of the separation seemed not the most important thing, but the unity was more important. The classic mystical experience is where the divisions melt down and one feels united with the whole of reality, with the whole of the human family. It's an undifferentiated unity. It's like things aren't separate anymore. Again, I often draw on my teacher, Karl Rahner, but Rahner says he thinks that our resurrection happens immediately when we die, that there's not an interim period, that it's immediate. And purgatory, whatever it is, it would be more instantaneous. Of course, in heaven, there's no watches and calendars. So, we move out of this time-space dimension. And Rahner also thinks that when your husband died, he became more related to you and his family and to the rest of the world than he was before. Just like we say about Jesus in his resurrection, when he was raised to life, he became more related to the human family, more related to all the parts of the earth than before. And again, that's speculation. That's theological speculation. I mean, nobody's been there and knows it and come back to tell us about it. But that is what one important theologian says, that what your husband experienced and sensed was what he thinks the reality is. That we're connected in, and we'll feel and see and know that connection, and we'll be more connected with this earth and people than we were before. From our viewpoint, they feel less connected because we don't see them and talk to them. My statement that I think I'm comfortable with is that I believe that my father is still for me, though he's deceased many years. To say that, I feel okay. I feel comfortable with saying that my father is still for me. I have no idea what that means in terms of the dynamics of the energy flow, but there's an energy flow I believe exists. And our communion of saints doctrine teaches us that. It's exactly what these figures teach us. We're in communion with them. That's what we say. And if we're communing with them, there's a flow. There's an energy flow. And if we think of ourselves as an energy matrix, then it's very possible for that to take many different forms. That energy matrix can take many different forms. And so when Paul talks about the spiritual body, maybe he's suggesting that energy matrix that I am takes other forms. But so those are live questions. But to me, rock bottom is your husband remains for you and remains related to you in his death. I don't know where we're going from here. Where are we going? That's good to hear from what people thought about Thessalonians. And people who didn't read anything, there's just one, it's chapter 4 that's in. I mean, it's not long. You can read it in a couple of minutes. That segment of the letter that talks about that. This isn't going to work. Obviously, it's not going to work. What am I going to do? Prepare for reading Galatians in one section. That's what I'm going to do. Sort of a quick thing on background to Galatians, and then we'll spend some time reading it's chapter 5 and 6. So I related Galatians to the freedom question. Freedom, big thing. We're big on freedom in the United States. We're blessed with freedom. We got religious liberty. We live in a world where a lot of people don't have that freedom, and we need to be grateful for it. We're also, and for us, freedom in this country has always meant getting our space. So we lived in a big country, so if you didn't like what was going on here on the East Coast, you moved west. You could always keep going west. You could keep going farther away. You could get away from people. Well, if the free person is, what was that movie, Easy Rider? That's the guy who's free. He had his motorcycle, he's, wow, no ties. The Marlboro Man, no ties, rides off, out of the village, out of the town, free of all ties. So that's a big part of freedom in the United States. It feels very different from freedom in other places very often. So it's a freedom from, it's distance, it's my space. There, So one of the things, we'd say, well, what about that notion of freedom? Does it get critiqued in any way? And then so now I'm looking at Galatians. So Paul wrote this thing in the middle 50s to people. It's actually disputed, but it's probably people who lived in modern-day Ankara, Turkey. There was a Roman province of Galatia, but most scholars think that isn't who he was writing to. He was writing to a group of Celts who had settled in the 3rd century BC around what is modern-day Ankara, Turkey, which is what about there? Where's our map? That never happened.
He's busy cooking.
Yeah, I know.
Give him a break.
Yeah, that's true. So that's where these people were, and Paul's there, and the Judaizers come, and they're saying Paul didn't preach a real gospel, and remember this, he wasn't there. He didn't know Jesus. So don't listen to him. He didn't know Jesus. So Paul, the whole letter of the Galatians is very defensive. It's combative. He's mad. He's writing his anger. He didn't sit down and write and tear it up. Sent it anyway. He's upset with these people. Yeah, right. Oh, Paul, settle down, rewrite it. Well, tomorrow, think it over. No, he's putting it out there, taking them on. So he's not happy with these Judaizers, and he's defending himself. It's a defensive letter. He's got to defend himself. But then it gets to the section on freedom, which we find in chapters 5 and 6. Which will be interesting reading. It starts out, chapter 5. Remember I told you the structure of a letter often has the opening thing and so on, then there's a body, and usually at the end of that there's an exhortation. What does this mean about living? So that's how it's in the Bible. Exhortation to Christian living. And it starts out, for freedom, Christ set us free. Great line. Great line. For freedom, Christ set us free. So stand firm and do not submit again to the yoke of slavery. Christ freed you. Don't be a slave. Don't be a slave to your own passions, to your own prejudices, to anything. Don't be a slave anymore. And then Paul goes on and talks about this freedom. For you are called for freedom, brothers and sisters. And then, now the caution. But do not use this freedom as an opportunity for the flesh. Rather, serve one another through love. So he recognizes that part of what goes wrong with freedom at times is you end up thinking of it as license. Freedom means I can do whatever I want. My life is my own possession. That's how we've thought about sexuality in our culture. That our sexuality is our own autonomous possession. Therefore, we can do with it whatever we want. Therefore, maximize sexual experience or sexual pleasure. So that's been, it is a theme running through our culture. It's a freedom that looks a little strange in the light of this. For you are called to freedom. Do not use freedom as an opportunity for the flesh. And that's not just sex, I must say. That means anything that's going to be selfish, egocentric, take me away from God. It's almost like he's saying, don't see freedom as do your own thing. Rather, serve one another in love. What's freedom about serving one another in love? Well, so the invitation is for us to meditate on that in Galatians. Do we need to know anything else about that? Why don't we spend 15 minutes? The people who want to meditate can do that, and we'll eat at 12:15. And then, we need to know when we're going to reassemble. That's what we need to know. I want a longer break somewhere in the afternoon, probably. Here's my proposal, that we reassemble at 1, and then we'll do the next one, and then have a longer break for people who want to take a nap. And then we'll do the last one, and we'll have Mass at 1:15. Okay? So you got 15 minutes to work with freedom, or anything else in Galatians that you want.